Tall Tales. The Nymph Symphony.
Chapters.
Chapter 5. Eclipse. I felt my nerves tingle as we slowly migrated across the dark blue fog of this cold, damp wetlands. My heated breath frosted in the air as we continued to cautiously ride along the rocky forest road. I felt afraid of the very shadows I could control, which swayed freely in the gentle wind rustling the trees. Generally, there was safety to such a deathly calm, but this eerie swamp just felt more alive and carnivorous because of it. We continued to move through the swamp in close formation and came upon a candlelit glass shrine, a bright beacon of hope in this dangerous darkness. We dismounted our rides to investigate it. It had a moth-shaped head, with two burning candles resembling eyes, and flaming glass pillars to represent glowing antennae. It was beautifully decorated with flowers and thornless swamp vines, priceless ruby rings, silver necklaces with emerald and aquamarine pendants, and numerous other precious gemstones dangled inside the statue's glass stomach like a bandit's bounty. An incredible spectrum of light was being emitted because of these translucent stones, reflecting the contrast of the candlelight's flame across both glass eyes, as the overhanging antlers trailed a mild but mesmerizing iridescence that dispersed out of the moth's head. The inviting tiny wax fire illuminating like a magical aura as each subtle breeze altered its color, continuously changing the unique flavors of that fire as it quietly whistled, enclosed and protected from any harsher kind of breeze. We all knew what the statue was. It was a Nyx statue, and it marked the close proximity of a recent gnoll invasion. There were shrines like this in every village. Even our great castle has one, although it was rare to see one lit up, as most are ancient relics of a long-forgotten past. They were created as an offering to the wisp gods of old worship, ancient guardian nymphs who were said to have evolved wings, which they'd used to fly away from our cursed land. They were depicted as ascended beings who had evolved in ways so extreme that their wings could feed them with nothing but the light of the sun and the moisture in the air, which is why it's said they live in the heavens above. Most rural villagers were still quite devout to the belief of these magical deities, comforted by the thought of angels watching over them. They imagined the angels as remorseful, looking down from their paradise on top of the clouds and taking pity on the plight of those lost, stranded, and suffering. The villagers believed if they created these Nyx shrines, the angels would see the sparkles of rainbow light during the darkness of dreaded nightfall and rescue those they deemed worthy of salvation. Ares was the first to approach the statue, completely unfazed by all the old stories, shrugging at the very concept of them as he put his hand on the shrine's head. It wasn't hard to see why he was a non-believer, given the life he has had to endure, and the lack of divine intervention that had happened when the gnolls stole his homeland and abducted many of his people. It was clear he had no faith in such religious ideology after all that. He shoved his hand into the cavity and grabbed all the jewelry inside, cramming them into his pocket before smothering the shrine's flame with his hand. "They don't exist," he announced. "All these things do is attract the gnolls. Now let's get out of this place." He stepped back down. The rest of us hesitated, shocked by his actions, but eventually the prince, Ebony, and Rediment accepted his orders and moved away to remount their spiders. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't allow him to get away with desecrating another nymph's beliefs. Forest nymphs would donate their most valuable possessions into those shrines, lighting the candles as a plea to the wisps to rescue a child or a loved one who the gnolls had taken. They acted as memorials to those lost but not forgotten, and Ares had just defiled one. "Put it back," I protested, failing to mask my absolute disgust in him. "Are you giving me orders?" he said, with a softened hatred in his voice. My heart raced at the first thought of conflict, although I was doing my best to appear determined and unthreatened by him, matching his serious stare with my own. "She's right," Ebony then declared, surprisingly the first to come to my defense. Ares looked about and saw from everyone's face that he was alone. my wife believed in these stupid statues. Enough to stand right beside one when the gnolls took her from me. She thought it would save her," he said, trying to sway everyone's minds. "These jewels serve us more than they ever would here," he continued, speaking a little louder this time, with a maddening aggravation beginning to vex his voice. Radamant, who was usually quick to calm his comrade's aggressive attitude, was being unusually quiet. He was holding his lantern tightly and staring into the darkness, seeming not to hear the conversation. "You've never been married, heiress," Arlo retorted, contesting the whole premise of the Sand King's argument. "What? Yes, I was," he fumbled, failing to persuade anyone with his lies. "So what's her name?" I asked, backing up the prince. She... Damn it! He shook his head as he surrendered his argument. "Well, I still don't believe in them," he muttered under his breath. "Whether you believe in them or not doesn't matter," the prince stated. "The villagers here do believe, so those gems stay here where they've left them," Arlo said with a strong and admirable fortification. It was the first admirable act I'd ever seen him perform. To take control how a good leader would. "Just put them back and let's go," he ordered, reaching his hand out for them, fearlessly confronting the Sand King. Eris angrily removed the jewels from his pocket, annoyed with his sudden loss of authority. A former king who never had need to obey anyone now having to, at great insult, relinquish his treasure. "They were for the kingdom," he bantered as the prince placed the jewels back in the shrine. "Their taxes already pay the kingdom," Arlo defiantly stated as he pulled a flint rock from beside the statue and prepared to reignite the candles. Radamant slapped the flint from Arlo's hand before he could spark the wicks alight, the rock dropping hard enough to make a small splash into one of the countless puddles around us as Radamant waved his hands like a fly flapping its wings, trying to signal something. Everyone, but me, ducking as they knew instantly what it meant. I opened my mouth to ask what was going on when Radamant yanked me down beside him. He pointed into the distance, over towards a small swamp saffron pond in the jungle's darkness. It took me a moment to look past the reeds and see what he was actually pointing at. I rubbed my eyes in shaded disbelief. There was a small critter in a shallow pond a short distance from us, completely covered under a black leathery shroud, raised upon its two hind legs, picking at the oozing sap from the swamp plantations with its enormous fanged teeth. It looked feral, just like it had been described in the stories told to me. It was small, though, being the size of a gnome or an imp. Oddly enough, I didn't feel like it would be aggressive. It moved like a child as it playfully picked at the bright berries along the yellow and green reeds of the shallow swampland pond, hardly looking like the fierce and savage scavenger I'd imagined. "It's just a child," Radamant whispered softly. "It hasn't seen us yet," Arlo whispered back as we all huddled together. "Well, we should walk away before it does see us," I said. "Or we could creep past it," Ebony suggested. "No," Eris said firmly. "It's too risky. If it's here, then others must be close by." "But we were given orders to run under any circumstance of trouble," I nervously reminded him. "It's hardly trouble," Arlo countered. Honestly, it was like a déjà vu, as we were having the exact same conversation we had had when we'd first entered this place. We waited patiently for Eris to make up his mind. It's just as risky in any direction we walk, and the Eclipse would sooner end forward than going back now, he explained. "We should quietly trap it and then continue," he decided. "No!" I revolted, reluctant to attack a creature who hadn't even seen us yet. Eris grabbed my shoulders. "They are pack hunters, you silly broad. If we do not bind it down, it will see us and cry to the others for help." The anger in Eris's voice, scaring me into my own shy nodding acceptance. "Our spiders could web it in no time, Kaya. It's what they're best at." Radamant reassured me while looking back and forth between the creature and me, too afraid to let it move away from his sight. "They won't harm it, I swear," he added, evaluating the worried expression I still had on my face. The group nodded in agreement while I reluctantly persisted with my argument. I don't like this plan, guys. We don't need to provoke them when we're in their land, I muttered cowardly to Aris as he attempted to creep towards his colossal ant. He turned back sharply and shoved me ever so slightly. This is our land, not theirs, he weakly snarled. And let's get one thing straight. I am only here because you couldn't do this yourself. He then scolded me, raising his voice as much as he could afford without the gnoll in nearby distance overhearing. Please just trust my counsel as commander, and obey what I say before your loud mouth gets us killed. I nodded in scared approval, adhering his instructions as he pointed for me to hop back on Bala while Radamant removed his spider's harness. The spider stealthily vanishing into the trees overhead. I saw only a blur as it dropped onto the poor gnoll and proceeded to spray and spin it with webs, encasing the creature in a cocoon in mere milliseconds. Watching with horror as the spider then proceeded to tether and pull the gnoll up into a tree along with it. The webbed cocoon making it up to the first branch before it snapped and dropped. A dark image launched out from another tree in order to catch it, while our startled spider scampered away in retreat. A large gnoll tending to its trapped infant, puddles splashing muck all about as eyes from everywhere started glancing towards us. My mind went blank as a shivering terror fell over me. All about the swamp pools, gnolls were emerging by the dozen, spawning and spewing out of the crevices they'd been hiding in as they swarmed us from out of the swamps. Others dropping from the tree canopy, the noise of 100 rustling leaves echoing before they began landing directly into our sight. We didn't have a moment to hesitate, nor did we take one. Radamant jumped onto his unharnessed spider as it ran towards us, Aris's ant taking a few vaulting leaps as it launched into flight. For the rest of us, the gnolls had charged at us from all angles, leaving us with no choice but to go straight up. We swayed from left to right as our spiders climbed up the trees and then continued to flee through the canopy. I ducked and dodged branches as Vala leapfrogged us through the tree line, following the others in blind escape. The gnolls reappeared, digging their huge claws into the trees as they swung after us. We were hopelessly outmatched, cut off in all directions. Laughed leaping over branches as gnolls climbed and dropped from under and above. Some would fall, but it was of no consequence to them. They were everywhere. There was no means of escape, no source of sunlight to save us before the gnolls grabbed and dragged us down with them. But we continued to flee anyway. I looked over my shoulder. Radamant was falling behind, clubbing angry gnolls with his lantern stick as they leapt at him, while he desperately clung to his spider with his only free hand. Having little to hold on to, still unwilling to drop his great stick and barrel, of which he awkwardly cradled and carried together in his left hand. I watched in horror as a gnoll slashed its claws from behind him, catching his foot and forcing him into a clumsy fumble off his ride, dropping his keg as he clung to a branch with just the one hand. "He's down! He's down!" I shouted to the others ahead of me as Radamant lost his grip and dropped through the high tree-line canopy, falling towards the wetland swamps beneath our feet, his spider continuing to flee without him. Lord Aris swooping past my head, skyrocketing down to save his comrade. The other spiders quickly following in pursuit, abseiling down on their long silk lines, my chest becoming lighter as my stomach became more weightless. I clutched the harness tighter than I'd ever held anything before, just trying to prevent falling headfirst towards the swampy ground we were heading down into. Helplessly watching Radamant and Aris already battling below in the very center of this rummaged harvesting field. The sickening peril of witnessing countless four-legged beasts lunging at them one by one. The gnolls clawed at the Sand King's arms, which reactively fractured and dispersed huge gusts of sand from his pores. It looked as if his skin dried up and broke into billions of smaller pieces once touched. He smoked from left to right, sliding across the trench floor in an indescribable kind of fashion, with sand suspending off his body, blinding everything around him in one concentric whirlwind. He looked like a living sandstorm, an element of nature blowing one way before tornadoing in another. The gnolls rushing into this clouded storm in one fearless mass, and then simply vanishing, never to be seen again. Radamant lit his lantern and ignited the head of his flail with a bright burning flame. He swung it wildly, whacking gnolls as they jumped towards him. He drank some of his wine and spat it towards the lantern, breathing flames that pushed back the gnolls. I then watched in fascination as he jumped on top of his heavy barrel and began rolling around on it like a lumberjack riding a waterlog, while courageously hitting gnolls with his lantern flail as he moved backwards, then forwards. Once he'd cleared those nearest to him, Radamant spun his barrel towards the huge crowd near Eris. He dropped down on top of his barrel, sitting with his legs on either side of it, gripping the strong gold frames of its base before whacking the back end of the barrel with his burning lantern. The alcohol inside combusted in an instant, jetting out of the barrel's one tiny exit hole and rocketing Radamant into the cluster of gnolls, smashing through them. Radamant abandoning the soaring barrel as it schismed uncontrollably like a pinball bouncing from tree to tree. The alcohol from the barrel had dispersed into the air. Even at this height, I could feel its vapors seeping into my own lungs, hazing my focus and judgment, and making my head spin as Vala continued her slow vertical drop to the ground. The gnolls most impacted by the liquid's full effects deliriously started slipping and tripping over each other as they attempted to attack Radamant. "Lightweights." Radamant laughed and mocked them, boisterously taunting them as he leaped about, unhindered by his own hazy and debilitating concoction. Arlo was the first of us juniors to reach the ground, the most enthusiastic to jump off his spider and punch a gnoll square in its pouncing chest, with a force no dimmer than the very power Radamant's rocket barrel unleashed on all of his scattering adversaries. He then proceeded to pull out his sword all valiantly like, although tripping as he did it, affected by the same alcoholic mist as everyone else, quickly trying to shake away the grogginess before charging off to spark his own feud with the predators coming in from the left front. I was nothing but astounded. How sadistic and callous in nature they must have been in order to get a thrill from what was absolute fear and pandemonium for me. Arlo's spider was just as blood-hungry as he was, chasing a gnoll as it retreated. Arlo's long steel claymore sword swinging at nothing but air as the gnolls ran from the very sight of him. Pursuing the chase, Arlo's sword only gathered more momentum from each revolution it was swung, becoming a dizzying whirlpool cutting through the air as it tried to suck everything towards it. At first Arlo looked like a berserker without any sense of control, but before you knew it, he was near levitating through this spiral motion. The weight and drag of each swing becoming so full and heavy it seemed to ignite the next cycle as Arlo battled to maintain his balance in the twisting frenzy, lifting up the tiny ankle-high stream like a vacuum, a suction force trying to drag gnolls into it as they scattered away from the prince. Water drops had been flung into the air around my prince, with the droplets above him beginning to float, ceasing to obey gravity. The droplets sat there frozen in mid-air, creating a water sphere around him that dropped like a bucket of water when he finally stopped his intense spin. I reached the ground in the dead middle of the conflict. My adrenaline had long run out from being overexerted, simply replaced by a sick feeling in my heart and chest. Fortunately, however, I was still on Vala, and we sat both still and safe in the very epicenter of this flattened battle ring as a protective circle of fighters surrounded us, confining us into a protective zone. Unless absolutely necessary, I was uninterested in joining the conflict, afraid I might do more harm than good. I always feared the Eclipse for one particular reason, the same reason I had never become a warrior. Shadows required the dusk. During full daylight and pitch blackness, there are simply no shadows for me to use, other than faint glimmers of firelight here and there. My shadows could do little more than divert attention away from me. So I sat staggered, hearing the grunts, groans, and the clang of sharp steel hitting thick carapace and claws while on top of my skittish spiderling. I tried to look in all directions to keep track of the incoming danger, but everything was moving so fast. All I could tell was that there seemed to be hundreds of gnolls. Ebony had no weapons left to use. When she landed, she threw in her spear and lost it to the dark fog of war. She was grabbing gnolls as they came at her, rolling and flinging them into each other while she pounced and prowled left and right. She was a brawler like Arlo and Ares, but it was the berserker in her that I feared most of all. Afraid of what she might do as I watched her begin to erupt and lose control of herself, with the shadow cat in her barging out and bouncing off trees, leaving the defensive confines of her circle, allowing a gnoll to squeeze through her stampeding clutches as it set eyes directly on me. Unlike the others, however, it was real careful and slow in its approach, its face completely concealed behind a cloak, except for 2 razor-sharp fangs and satanic pale white beady eyes protruding from its cape, glaring towards me. The others, too focused on their own problems to notice that one had slipped through. "Someone help!" I shrieked towards the deaf and busy audience. I froze in fear as the gnoll charged at me, the electric rush of nerves flushing through my body and yet providing me with no useful countermeasures, leaving me motionless on my 8-legged mount. Hoping one of my friends would swoop in to save me, only to tumble backwards, knocked off by Vala as she responded to this threat. In need of breath after falling flat on my back, seeing that Vala was on just 4 legs, using her other half to wrap the gnoll up in web, I staggered back to my feet, winded but trying to shake out my small sword from my stiff left waist holder, watching another evil beast slip past the others and take a couple of steps towards me. Impulsively, my body jolted, only this time into a much more regrettable and foolish action. My hand tossed away the sword, my only defense, in a panic. The unbalanced hilt of my sword smacking that gnoll flat on the nose, making it shake its head angrily at me before focusing back on me. Saliva drooling through its blackened concealed mouth and into the dirt its claws were dug deeply into. I wanted to back away, but there were a dozen other gnolls behind me being blocked by Ares, who was guarding my flank. I had no choice but to brace myself and prepare for the worst. It leaped. I turned in panic, afraid that looking at the lunging creature might increase the chance of it hitting me. I braced for pain and felt something like wind or breath breathe across the back of my neck, roaring into its face as this gnoll wrestled free and scampered away. It was Ebony, her bright yellow eyes glaring towards me savagely, and then she focused her gaze back on the battle, sprinting towards that fray instead. She reverted back into a nymph as she found and picked up her wooden spear, breaking it on one enemy, only to use the blunt broken half like a wooden club on another. She stayed in her nymph form when fighting, but shifted back into that spirited animal whenever she needed extra momentum and speed, cunningly utilizing the advantages of both her forms. Fortunately for everyone, she maintained a sense of cognitive clarity and remained in control of her temper and fury, taming herself from the savage violence I'd been victimized by earlier in the day. Suddenly, the gnolls began vanishing, no doubt digging or swimming away in a hasty evacuation. Their once limitless army was suddenly isolated to a few small pockets of soldiers still resiliently attacking us. It finally felt safe. Our leader returning from the dust with just one lone enemy still inside. Joining him in combat, the prince swung his sword at this last gnoll. 3 small pace hits all blocked by the creature's fierce long claws. Arlo accelerating his swing with each thrusting slice, launching off the ground with an acrobat's athleticism, gathering more momentum in those aerial strikes, attempting to go through this creature's defenses rather than around them. This strong gnoll eventually was blasted by one final titanic blow, deshrouding itself, the sword piercing straight through its shattered claws and leathery cape shroud as it split into 2 equal pieces. All of us staring in disbelief at what we saw, or perhaps I should say, what we didn't see. Nothing but mist and dark empty air as each side of the shroud floated humbly towards the wet grassy pond floor. Arlo grabbed one half of the shroud and lifted it with sheer astonishment. "Where did it go?" he asked in a fluster. We all came close together again. "Is everyone all right?" Radamant asked as he sat down on his keg to regather his breath, his wine barrel refilling in the freezing shallow water through cleverly designed pressure vents. All of our feet drenched in the same foul swamp water he was filling it up with. I looked about before asking the same dumb question. Where did they all go? No one knows. They just go, Radaman said with a certain dispassionate lack of care, just as Ebony transformed back into her nymph self to see the split shroud up close. With the gnolls gone, we took a moment to relax. Arlo stabbed his sword into the ground and leaned against it exhaustedly. Is it all over? Will they come back? I asked, staring into the darkness again. Radaman's lantern was dimming. He scooped up more swamp water, which bubbled and fermented in his hand as he decomposed it into some thickened tar-based fuel, using that putrid concentrate to rekindle the lantern's dying pilot flame. Ebony had backed away and stood at least a few yards from us, getting some fresh air. She looked a little delirious, wobbling to stay upright. Perhaps the fight had taken more energy from her than I'd previously thought. Ebony, are you okay? I asked, concerned. Ebony, the prince then said moments later, her harem face tipping as she slowly drooped towards the mud. The prince rushed to catch her, putting one arm around her waist while he tapped her cheeks as a means to wake her with the other. He looked down, his eyes widening when he spotted a blow dart stuck in her side. Arlo then glanced quickly out into the darkness of the surrounding forest. Incoming! He shouted. Darts bombarded our vision as they flew towards him. They froze in midair around him, mere inches from his skin. An echoing sound wave exploded from him as he used his one solid sound wave to blast the darts back to their senders. Things thudded from the trees and bushes as a second wave of gnolls charged from the darkness. This wave was much larger than the last one. There were more than hundreds, maybe thousands. Gnolls pouring down on us like a maelstrom of movement. They hurled javelins and spears, and shot blow darts and crossbow bolts. Their organization was staggering. Everything I'd heard about them I instantly considered lies. These creatures weren't mindless at all. They were ruthlessly clever, strategically stalking and ambushing us, surrounding us so their darts could strike at us from all angles. A dart hit Radamant as he jumped behind his barrel for cover, and he pulled me down with him. A sharp stick flew towards me. I desperately placed my hand up to block it, unbelievably managing to deflect it with one misty bubble conjured from the back shadow of my hand. Radamant's lantern beside me giving the faintest of shine to do so, affording me the slightest protection as I coated a thin shadow barrier around me and him, protecting us from the gnolls' projectiles. Its thin fabric absorbed like darts like a tiny pincushion. I crouched further down beside Radamant and his barrel. He was sitting down, looking greatly dazed by the effect of the dart embedded in the left side of his overgrown belly. I slapped his cheek to try and rouse him. What do we do? Run, Kaya. Just run. He yelled before aggressively pushing me away and rising back to his feet, attempting to confront the incoming horde swooping in. He stumbled to walk, heavily disoriented from all the darts hitting him at once. But he defiantly resisted the dart's sleeping toxin as he physically held and pushed them back, stopping them from reaching me. Kaya! Run! He shouted at me, ordering me to run from him. I was still completely out of breath from earlier, but without any other ideas to consider. I ran just like he said. I turned back with tears in my eyes, to see him tackled by 2 or 3 of those beasts, disarming him successfully but somehow unable to stop him enduringly thrashing about. Resistant to the dart's intoxicating effects, the ladder of gnolls were keeping their distance from those restraining Radamant, continuously blowing darts into his exposed chest and back as they tried to take him down for good. He had saved my life, and the worst part about that was that I was barely moving through trenching pond water fast enough for his sacrifice to mean anything. But nevertheless, I continued to try and tearfully bolt away while he rolled about, unwilling to let the gnolls restrain him. I spotted Arlo beside Ares and his loyal aunt, carrying Ebony over his shoulders as he and the prince worked together to load her onto his great flying might. The darts were coming at all of them, but were luckily bouncing off the hard carapace of the ant's bony skin and protective wings. Hop on! Ares yelled to Arlo while I puffed a fair distance from both of them. He watched as Radamant battled behind me. struggling for freedom as I continued running to them for help. I looked back for a last time to see Radamant holding his lantern and tapping his barrel from its ignitable tap, slowly surrendering to unconsciousness as he did it. With nowhere to rocket but downwards against the mud, the barrel compressed and started crushing against the ground. "Hurry up! Just get on, Arlo!" Eris shouted to Arlo, who waited idly beside the ant for me to arrive, refusing to leave without all of us. I was sprinting towards him as fast as I could, but I was getting weak, and the trenching water only grew thicker and thicker from where in the middle of the small swamp pond I was running towards. The water level of the puddle constantly rising in depth, causing me to slug through mud that had already reached as high as my kneecaps, slowing me down as the gnolls spat darts and chased me from the rear. The spiders had all abandoned us, disappearing into the canopy, leaving Eris as my only hope of possible escape. "Just leave her," Eris shouted to the prince. I tried to go faster, thinking Eris might wait longer if I showed him I could hurry up. But then, something sharp stung my backside. My legs locked as heated numbness spread through both my thighs. I looked down in dread to see one stray dart embedded in my right-hand side as I fought to stay conscious, fearing a stumbling trip would force Eris and Arlo to abandon me. The crushing temptation of wanting to sleep was drawing me in, scaring me into thoughts of a shallow drowning within this small-level swamp. In pure panic, I managed to keep myself awake, desperately crawling my way through the swamp, while gnolls circled around me effortless. I kicked at them as they pushed me over and grabbed at my legs, my hostility becoming futile as most of them patiently just stood there waiting for me to drop by myself. I kicked at them as they pushed me over and grabbed at my legs. I put everything I had left into one last lunge, trying to push past the gnolls before falling and collapsing into the water. My body near covered, I turned my head to keep myself from drowning. "Stop. Please stop," I begged in a whisper, exhausted, as they started dragging me backwards, towards where Radamant and his flaming keg still remained. I was too exhausted to fight, and too terrified to cry. I felt paralyzed, my mind hazy like I was being smothered into sleep. Lying there, I just gave up, finding myself too scared and weak to struggle anymore. I watched the blackness slowly brighten as the flames from Radamant's barrel jutted out from its upward hole. I felt nothing but coldness as spiky metal hands tugged at my dress, dragging me as I lost all hope of possible escape. And then, suddenly, just like magic, the gnolls let me go. I opened my eyes and realized something had crashed onto them. I assumed it was the keg at first, but then saw Arlo kicking and punching the gnolls after having collided into them like a tucked-up cannonball. He fought relentlessly, attempting to break me free from their clutches. In the chaos of it all, Arlo found a moment to drag me up, harshly yanking my arms as I did my best to place my feet on the sinking swamp floor. I focused my energy into getting ready to run, only for Arlo to push me back down a moment later, forcefully dunking me and himself as I weakly wrestled to break free. I didn't know what was happening. Was he trying to drown me as a means of ending our combined suffering? Moments later, the ground quaked as the pierced keg exploded apocalyptically, with fire igniting the sky. Flames burned the trees, the water illuminating under the burning branches that were dropping like molten rain. Pulling my head back up as we both gasped for air. Ready to continue our struggle, we looked around, expecting gnolls to have surrounded us, only to find most of them had retreated from the explosion. The light revealed the magnitude of the gnolls' army, though, which was waiting nearby for the fires to recede, as if the light physically repelled them. There was no limit to their numbers. Their ghostly black leather shrouds and beady white eyes glowed in every single faraway tree, every bush and in every pond outside of the explosion's radius. Arlo and I started running back the way we'd come, just as the fires rapidly diminished in this muggy swamp, chased by this barbaric horde. We looked for Aris and spotted his vague silhouette in the sky, sailing off with Ebony. He didn't so much as glance back to see if we had survived the blast. "Come on," the prince yelled, refusing to give up as he pulled my arm around his shoulders and helped drag me away from the marching gnolls. Arlo must have seen something in the light of the explosion because he began hurrying towards it. I didn't ask what it was. I was too out of breath and my mind was too foggy to form any coherent words in order to ask him. I thought he might want to relight the Nyx statue, and I hoped he wouldn't leave our fate to an act of religious propaganda. I kept up with him though, and he helped carry me over fallen burned trees and avoid the deep areas of swamp until we managed to get back onto the old gravel road. The gnolls were gaining on us, their own shadows flickering behind them as we limped away from the dwindling but protective spot fires. I threw my hand out behind me, while I still had the strength to do so, forging as many thorny vines from their tiny silhouette as I could, snagging and tripping the gnolls over, giving us an extra few seconds to move and act. Arlo ordered, pointing to a deep hole in the ground. It was so dark now I couldn't even see his face, yet he was asking me to jump down the hole first without any idea of what was at the bottom, or how deep it even went. "I can't," I trembled, too terrified to do it. "Trust me," he said, trying to guide me down. "You go first," I argued stubbornly, only for him to forcefully shove me down. I took the deepest breath I could, sucking up all the courage I had left in me as I fell endlessly. Either the hole was bottomless or the speed I was falling was being slowed quite favorably, but either way, I dropped further and further down, unable to see anything in the blackness of long descent. Blinding terror wiping away the drowsy effects of the dart. The fear of a hard stone landing compelling me to fight the sleeping paralysis still plaguing my body while I continued to pin drop down. My feet hit the surface first, falling straight through it, splashing into an ocean of deep fresh water. The column hadn't widened at all from the small cylindrical walls I first jumped into. They felt sturdy like stone or concrete. After placing both hands onto each side of the wall to gain my bearings, I soon realized I was in an old abandoned well. A safe site I wished Arlo had informed me of before he'd pushed me off the edge. I heard the scraping of stone above as Arlo came crashing down after me. I pushed myself as close to the wall as I could, hoping the large, bulky man wouldn't land directly on me. Thankfully, he splashed beside me, sinking deep into the water. I reached for him, but I couldn't feel him. After all, without my hands against the wall, I was starting to sink myself. It was only then that I realized my armor was taking in water and weighing me down. I tried ripping at its knots, trying to undo them. But they were soaked, and my efforts were only tightening them more. Arlo suddenly broke through to the surface, his lightweight half-plate chest armor being beneficial after all. He saw me struggling to stay afloat and pulled out a tiny knife to cut at its strings. My armor dropping off me and silently sinking to what I could only assume was the Earth's lowest bedrock. The man then loudly crunched his knife into the wall to better his grip and hang on with just the one hand while we both paddled our feet to stay upright. "We're going to die in here," I said to him in a stuttering shiver. "It's okay. It's okay. We'll be okay," he gasped in tremor back to me, sounding just as frozen as I was. I could sense he was terrified too, although his refusal to admit it gave me an odd feeling of comfort. It was reassuring to have someone who was calm and composed when I had all but given up. The water was close to freezing, and although the night impaired my vision to mere black and white, I could tell by the way his body was shaking that his lips were a numbing blue. "Give me a moment. I need to focus," he said, spitting out surface water as he did his best to hang on to my hand with one of his, while his other hand gripped the embedded knife. The cold water was cramping my muscles, but it was at least fighting off the sleepiness from the dart. I was relying completely on Arlo's hand to keep me afloat as I slipped and slid, struggling to hang on to the smooth stone walls with the other. I looked up to see the gnolls gathered around the top of the well. They started throwing heavy rocks down at us. We were trapped in here, and I was fairly positive this was the end. There were so many things I wanted to say as last words, but I was too cold to form them. I wanted to thank Arlo for coming back for me, and to ask if he had any regrets in his life. The more I started thinking about my own, the more I wished I hadn't. I felt warmer as I reflected on all of these silly desires. I could tell my focus was improving and making me stronger. Naturally, I just assumed it was an epiphany that helped rejuvenate my attitude. But in reality, I had begun feeling warmer because the water was actually warming. That in my own mindless delirium, I had become too distanced to notice that my body wasn't the only thing shaking anymore. The entire well had suddenly started to shake, frothing and bubbling as it vibrated in increasing warm waves. Through some form of meditative focus, the prince was pressuring the well and beginning to boil the water as a result of all this condensing pressure. The rock and darts halted inches from our heads, floating in the air as the gnolls threw more and more to pile upon it. Water was splashing into my mouth and face, vaporizing to steam as Arlo made it easier for us to float. "Grab hold of me," Arlo said as the water grew to an almost burning heat. "Sorry if it hurts," he added, letting go of the knife and wrapping his bulky arms around my waist as we sunk underwater. An explosion of pressure had suddenly hit us from underneath. I managed to squint my eyes open, water blasting into my face. We were tumbling through the air, leaves battering us as we broke tree branches and flung towards the pitch-black clouds. Arlo had pressurized the well until it had literally shot us out like a cannonball. I had to admit, I was impressed by his ingenuity. We escaped our deadly situation, passing through eclipsing clouds and exiting the nocturnal darkness, happily returning into the twilight as our ascent began to slow down. Our bodies re-expanded from the condensed curling balls that the pressure had forced us to become. We started waving our arms and floating above the clouds. Arlo was an arm's length below me, his armor weighing down his ascent ever so slightly. Without a doubt, it was the most spectacular sight I'd ever seen. An aeronautical view of the world from above the blanketing clouds. It was beyond beautiful. The elegant, tranquil meadows looked like the world's most colorful and prized painting. Its lakes and valleys appeared almost unrealistic in its authentic dust coloring while seen from space. I could see Ambervale Cove with its maple-colored beach sands and sapphire-colored coral sea, its waves crashing along the long mountainous coastline that would lead us back to the capital.